Before letters were born and before the earth knew its name, there were humans not exactly like us, yet in their eyes there was something of us. In a time uninhabited by light, they lit a small fire to keep the cold away. They spoke without words, loved without promises, and mourned in silence that no one heard. They left behind no books or buildings, yet their spirits still walk behind us, hiding in silence and in a longing we cannot explain. This is not just a story of science, but a story of a human shadow passing through darkness and then disappearing tens of thousands of years ago. Before the first letter was written and before the first map was drawn, the Earth was a place completely different from what we know today. Winters were harsh, lasting months. Snow fell silently, but it did not melt, covering the ground with thick layers of cold and silence. There were no cities, roads, or houses, only vast expanses of dense forests, deep valleys, and massive animals roaming freely, from mammoths to saber-toothed cats. In this wild, frozen world of beasts and snow, a type of human appeared, slightly different from us but with familiar features. Their bones were shorter and stronger, their foreheads more pronounced, and their bodies adapted to survive the extreme cold. They were known as the Neanderthals. No one knows exactly how they got this name. It came from a German valley where their first bones were discovered. Over time, the name became synonymous with an entire chapter of human history, a chapter we do not fully understand, but that resides deep within us. Neanderthals lived in Europe and parts of Western Asia for nearly 300,000 years until their extinction around 4,000 years ago. They were not temporary visitors, but the original inhabitants of the land. They built their lives on ice and under gray skies. They carried fire in their hands, dug shelters for themselves, and faced death daily while searching for food or fleeing new predators. Yet, despite all this, they were not monsters. They were not mere physical struggle against nature. There was something of us in them, something unspoken but felt. Perhaps from this begins the real story of what makes us human. In a world dominated by wind and long nights, life was not measured in words nor built with stone alone. Neanderthals had to invent their own ways to survive, not only against the cold and hunger, but also against loneliness. Since nature did not provide the warmth of walls or the comfort of villages, they made their tools from hard stone with rough fingers, flint knives, pointed stone spearheads, and primitive hammers carried for many years. These tools were not mere hunting instruments, but extensions of their bodies, evidence of their skill and patience. Fire was their constant companion, not a luxury but a necessity. They knew how to strike stones to spark flames and nurture them with their breath until the fire blazed. Around that fire they gathered during long winter nights, seeking the fleeting comfort it offered in a merciless world. Under the smoke of the wood, eyes exchanged unspoken messages, hands silently shared roasted meat, and stories were told in prolonged silence. They did not have language as we know it today, but they were not mute either. They had a primitive form of communication, sounds and hums conveying meaning, though not complex sentences or abstract concepts. Their faces spoke, their hands explained, and their eyes said what their mouths could not. Simple gestures were enough, raising an eyebrow, tilting a shoulder. Each movement carried meaning without forming a narrative or complex idea. Inside their caves, whispers and hums barely echoed off stone walls, but were enough to reassure a child of safety or warn a group of approaching danger. They knew how to communicate, but not how to express everything. Despite their lives being filled with fear of predators, freezing cold, and relentless hunger, they were not cruel. Evidence suggests something deeper: compassion. In the cave of El Cedron in Spain, remains of a Neanderthal child with a genetic disorder were found, carefully buried. They did not abandon him to die, they cared for him until his last breath. Perhaps this shows they understood mercy and that their hearts were no colder than ours. There are also signs they might have been among the earliest artists. In some caves, traces of natural pigments were discovered, likely used to decorate bodies or stones. Some handprints on walls suggest they wanted to say, "We are here. We live, we feel, we leave traces." Moments of grief were not absent. When one sat near a deceased body and placed a small stone or dried flower beside it, it was not meaningless. It expressed something we may not fully understand, but can feel deeply. Loneliness was perhaps the greatest challenge. Despite communal living, each individual had an inner cave, a silent isolation in a dangerous world. From this solitude arose some of their deepest feelings, a heavy sensation when silence prevails and anticipation becomes the only language. Their daily life was full of challenges, from cold and hunger to the constant struggle for survival. For Neanderthals, the day began before sunrise, not out of love for the morning, but because the cold did not wait. Leaving the cave was already a challenge. The wind lashed the trees, snow covered the ground, and predators might be nearby. Yet movement was necessary. They had to hunt, gather firewood, or find food, for hunger showed no mercy. There were no food storages, no tools to preserve meat, no warm shelters. Everything was taken day by day. In the morning, men, and sometimes women, carried spears and entered the forest, silently observing, tracking footprints, listening for faint sounds. Hours could pass without seeing anything. When prey appeared, it could be closer than expected, but far more dangerous. Hunting was an adventure, but not heroic as we imagine. Often it was a battle with the unknown. One animal could provide food for days or claim the life of a group member. Although Neanderthals were physically strong, nature always held the advantage. Cold exhausted them, hunger slowed their movements, and fear never disappeared. Those who stayed in the cave faced no easier life. Women gathered roots, herbs, and the few remaining fruits among the rocks. Children, once past crawling age, helped arrange tools, carry firewood, or watch the sky, awaiting the return of hunters. There was no time for play or stories. Everything around them reminded them that survival was not a right, but an opportunity. Fire was more than warmth, it was the heart of life. Around it, families cooked meat, repaired tools, and treated wounds. If the fire went out, everything risked death. Therefore, there was always a vigilant eye and a hand close to the flames, fearing that wood might fail or wind might extinguish it. Their days were harsh and nights even more so. Wind howled behind rocks and cold seeped under thick hides. Sometimes a person would die in sleep, not from illness, but because their body could not endure. No cries, no noise, only their body left the group, and life continued with the same caution. During droughts or famines, darkness deepened. Archaeological evidence indicates that some Neanderthal groups resorted to eating corpses, not out of cruelty, but survival. In a world that gives nothing, they took what remained, however painful. Yet life was not only struggle and misery. Small moments of warmth existed. A hunter returning with food, a woman laughing at a child's movement, repairing an old spear, or discovering a flower amid the snow. These moments were few, but precious. Their lives were not comfortable, but they were real. They knew each day could be their last, yet they persevered, fighting cold with hides, hunger with patience, fear with silence. They complained not, expected nothing, simply endured. In the depths of those silent caves, death was not merely an end. It had its own rituals. When death approached, it was not met with denial or flight. They had no medicine, no comforting words, no written rites. Yet through their silent traces we see that the concept of death was not foreign. They faced it in their own way as they had faced cold and hunger, but this time without fire, without weapons. In caves spanning from France to Iraq, scientists have discovered astonishing scenes, unrepeatable moments among creatures who knew grief. In the caves of La Chapelle-aux-Saints or Chanidar in France, skeletons of Neanderthals over 50 years old were found. Despite severe arthritis, missing teeth, and inability to walk or chew properly, these individuals had survived for months or even years. They were not left to die alone. Their groups cared for them. This alone speaks volumes. They were not merely strong hunters. They understood compassion, help, and even sacrifice. More profound was their way of saying farewell. In multiple caves, remains were carefully buried, not left for scavengers. Bodies were placed in pits and covered with sand, clay, or stones. Sometimes flowers, small tools, or food remnants accompanied them. Some might argue this was coincidence, but repetition across locations and times points to a deeper meaning. Neanderthals seemed to send messages to the absent, or even to the living in the cave. In Shanidar Cave, northern Iraq, dating back over 50,000 years, a Neanderthal man was found in a pit filled with pollen. Not one flower, but a full assortment, some with medicinal properties, some purely decorative. They were carefully arranged, not scattered by wind, but placed by hands that knew what they were doing. That moment when a Neanderthal hand placed a flower near a loved one said everything. They did not see death as annihilation, but as a farewell deserving beauty. Perhaps some cried, "We cannot know," but tears are not limited to words. One only needs to sit in a cave corner, away from the fire, observing shadows on the wall to understand that sorrow lived in those silent eyes. They may have grieved through silence or by pausing hunting, or sitting beside the deceased until the body cooled. Often personal tools, a small stone knife, a carved bone, or a simple dried herb necklace were buried with the dead. These held no material value, only symbolic meaning, a part of the living to accompany the deceased beyond the end. Even children were treated with this care. In some caves, skeletons of infants under 1 or 2 years were placed in special protected spots. Their bodies were wrapped in available hides or plants and quietly covered. Sometimes small objects, like toys, were placed with them. No one buries a child this way without knowing love. All these details reveal that Neanderthals understood absence, and that death did not end with a stopped heart. They left traces not only in stone, but in unseen emotions, buried feelings, hidden yet real, strong and affecting. In a world without writing, a flower on a grave was a message. Perhaps this is why, when we look at these dried flowers beside ancient bones, we feel nostalgia. We sense we are not strangers to them. We are extensions of them. Not just descendants in genes, but in grief, rituals, and the silent moments of farewell when we place something small beside a loved one, simply because we do not know what else to say. Even the strongest spirits cannot endure forever. Time leaves nothing unchanged. While Neanderthals continued their lives in shadow, the first signs of change slowly approached, not as a sudden storm, but as a cold breeze that crept in, eventually threatening to extinguish their fire. The extinction of Neanderthals was not sudden. Their culture did not collapse in one night. The end began quietly, a slight shift in wind, subtle changes in the environment, gradually growing like a cold cloud unnoticed until it enveloped everything. Climate change was not new to Neanderthals. They had survived harsh winters before. But around 1,000 years before their disappearance, the cold lasted longer. Resources grew scarcer, and the animals they relied upon migrated or disappeared. Each passing winter brought more losses, smaller herds, faster extinguishing fires, frozen caves, children unable to endure the cold. Even medicinal and edible plants became rare. Streams froze, forcing families to break ice each morning with bare hands. Hunting became a daily struggle for survival against hunger, fear, and exhaustion. Life became harsher every day. Then, in the distance, smoke appeared on the horizon, not from their fires, but from a new civilization, modern humans, Homo sapiens, arriving from the south. Their arrival was gradual, tentative steps at the forest edges, light footprints in the snow, unintelligible sounds, but their presence grew daily. They looked different from Neanderthals, despite close genetics. Leaner, faster, perhaps more adaptable. They carried new tools, different hunting techniques, clearer language, and perhaps stories, myths, and dreams. There was no war, no sword raised, no stabbing sounds, but there was a silent, unseen struggle, leaving no wounds on flesh, only in the balance of existence. Neanderthals, accustomed to small, scattered groups, could not match the expansion of modern humans. Homo sapiens moved in larger numbers, shared resources, built networks, and gradually occupied land without consciously planning. They sought survival, just as Neanderthals did, but their methods allowed greater adaptability. In some regions, coexistence lasted briefly. There is evidence of interbreeding, creating children carrying traits of both species. Yet, ultimately, balance was impossible. Over time, caves emptied. Places once filled with the sounds of fire, whispers, and laughter became silent. Animals no longer had pursuers. Paths once used by Neanderthals disappeared under snow and oblivion. The air grew harsher, colder, but that was not the only reason. There was an unseen force pressing on their souls, a strange feeling of contraction, slow disappearance. Individual by individual, groups vanished. Not because they did not fight, but because the world changed faster than they could endure. Sometimes the end of a people is not in battle, but in unnoticed silence. That is what happened to the Neanderthals. They were not defeated. They faded, like steam from a child's breath on a cold morning, little by little, until only memories and bones remained. Yet even after their disappearance, questions remained. Who was the last of them? Did they know the end was near? Perhaps it was an old man in a small cave, contemplating the muddy footprints of loved ones, or a woman carrying a child weakened by cold, singing in a tune not our own but full of love, or a small child carrying ancient blood, playing alone in the corner of an abandoned cave, his voice fading forever. Imagine that final moment, a small fire about to go out, a body wrapped in bear hide, blackened stone walls, and outside, a snowstorm screaming at the land, covering everything in frost. Inside, eyes watch the darkness in complete silence. No one hears, no one comes. Neanderthals left no temples, no statues, no palaces. But something deeper remained. An imprint in us. In the early 21st century, specifically 2010, genetic studies confirmed that modern humans still carry small traces of Neanderthal DNA, ranging from 1% to 4%. These are remnants of ancient interbreeding tens of thousands of years ago when our paths met. Thus, their disappearance was not absolute. They no longer walked the earth, but their blood flows in our veins, in our bones, in our faces, and perhaps in our senses. Something faint, hidden in the ancient memory we carry deep within. Today, when we look in the mirror, we may see faint shadows from that distant time. And in the silent night when everything quiets, we may feel something deep inside us, not from the present, but from a past we never knew, yet which never left us entirely. This is how the story of the Neanderthals ends, not with noise or light, but with a long, quiet silence, like snow covering the world without a sound. They were not myths nor mysterious shadows in the record of evolution. They were human, with faces, dreams, fear, and love. They lived as we do in a world unlike ours, harsh, wild, unforgiving. Yet they tried. We may never fully know all they felt, wished, or hoped would be said about them after departure. But it is enough that they lived here, walked the forests we walk today, looked at the same sky, and left an echo of their lives. When we are silent and listen carefully, we may hear something of their story in our depths, a faint tremor of an old yearning, nameless, a tear falling without explanation. For the past does not disappear, it whispers,